If you caught the start of the show, you'd have heard me reiterate how most farmers voted for Brexit. Had they not, this country wouldn't be £100 billion a year worse off as far as trade with the EU goes, and Rachel Reeves wouldn't necessarily be looking at taxing family farms to make up the difference, which ultimately, people aren't going to like the question, but it does beg the question whether farmers are simply reaping what they sowed. You can't look at the issue of family taxes or inheritance tax on family farms. You can't look at it separately from Brexit, because the costs of Brexit are hurting this country and the Chancellor's trying to make up that difference. But, of course, with Starmer and Reeves refusing to move any of their self-imposed red lines to re-engage with the EU, with growth flatlining, the Chancellor's had a bumpy ride with a budget trying to raise billions to fix this country after 14 years of appalling mismanagement. Now, they promised Labour not to raise income tax and have had to look elsewhere to find money to meet bills. Going after pensioners, not all of whom are poor, I accept, but many of whom are, has proven massively unpopular. Is subjecting family farms to inheritance tax just as controversial, especially when you bear in mind that the curious poster boy for modern farmers these days, the slap-happy motoring hack Jeremy Clarkson, famously told The Times 3 years ago that he only bought his £4.25 million family farm to avoid paying inheritance tax in the first place. Oops. That's not to say that Labour's handling of the inheritance tax situation has been laudable, far from it. And Starmer insists 3/4 of farmers won't pay a penny in inheritance tax. Hooray! But farmers then point to DEFRA figures that suggest 66% of farm businesses are worth more than the £1 million threshold at which inheritance tax will now have to be paid. Although that itself is slightly more... It's not really as clear as that, because Starmer counters that by pointing out how farmers must add the £1 million for the farmland to the £1 million exemption for your spouse. And he says that, so for most couples with a farm wanting to hand on to their children, he says the realistic limit at where you're going to pay inheritance tax is actually £3 million. He insists, Starmer, that we just need to, I'm quoting, we just need to keep explaining how that works, because I know it's caused some anxiety. Is explaining how it works enough to deter farmers from protesting? Probably not. What if Starmer said, hey farmers, let's go back into a customs union with the EU to boost UK trade and help British farms rather than hit them with a new inheritance tax? Would that satisfy farmers like those in the North East who voted by nearly 60% for Brexit? Source, Science Direct Journal of Rural Studies, January 2021. Because there's a strong argument that Starmer only needs to introduce an inheritance tax on farmers because of the huge financial costs of Brexit, which the majority of those self-same farmers voted for. Now, last week, The Guardian published a frankly eye-opening first-person piece by a farmer called Guy Singh Watson. And he describes how he looked into the detail of Labour's proposal with views on how large farms... He's got strong views on how large a farm needs to be economically viable. And he initially felt that the tax was iniquitous and unfair. But as I said, he looked into the details, realised that the threshold in reality is closer to 3 million. He says Labour should have done a better job of making it clear that it's kind of 3 million. Singh Watson then argues that more valuable farms, so he's broadly now in favour of the tax, having looked into the detail, and he actually argues that more valuable farms should pay increasingly high rates of inheritance tax. He says when a farm is worth £7 million or more, it should be on 40%, because he says that the Labour policy on taxing farms is going to protect small family farms from inheritance tax, but it's not going to protect big family farms. Maybe they shouldn't. What's more, Singh Watson highlights a missed opportunity, he says, where the Chancellor could have chosen to go after farmers who sell land with planning permission instead of going for the inheritance tax changes, because planning permission can increase farmland values 100-fold, but farmers who benefit from such windfalls can pay no tax whatsoever on that deal if the cash is reinvested in more land. Singh Watson concludes that taxing these capital gains could arguably have raised more money than the current posse would probably be far less contentious. So I'm saying my starting point for this is farmers in the majority voted for Brexit. Brexit has cost this country a pretty penny. We are now looking for ways to make up that loss. Should farmers bear some of that cost? Should they? Should some farmers bear some of that cost? They're paying inheritance tax at half the rate of everybody else. Well, Tom Bradshaw is the National Farmers Union President. Joins me first. Good morning to you, sir.
Good morning.
So you've got one small farmer, at least, who feels that the position Labour's taken is fair.
Although I think he summed it up by saying it's the wrong tool, it's a blunt instrument, it could have been done much better.
Yes.
If we keep on getting to this £3 million figure that Sir Keir Starmer tried to trundle out on Friday, if that's the figure that government now believe should be in place, why don't we just move the limit to £3 million?
I totally agree, Tom. I can't argue with that because it just seems so much clearer to me, and I think to the listeners and to your members, yeah, I do.
But also every individual circumstance. Look, the personal, the human impact of this is the bit that I'm struggling with most. When I get a letter from a 93-year-old that until 1:30 p.m. on Wednesday the 30th of October, the best tax advice was for them to keep their asset until death. That changed overnight. They are not going to live for the next 7 years. They have no way of gifting that farm to the next generation without paying exorbitant tax. That is something which is simply not acceptable.
But things change, Tom, and farmers who voted overwhelmingly for Brexit.
Where do you get that figure from? Sorry, where do you get that figure from? That was one from the Northeast, 60%.
So
is that overwhelming?
No, that was one of the figures that I came from the paper that I read out the details for. The sources Science Direct Journal of Rural Studies, January 2021. It's a huge, long paper. It goes through region by region, sex by sex, different levels of what level of employment you have within the farm. And trust me, the paper makes an overwhelming case that farmers voted for Brexit. And unless you have information to the contrary, we'll have to go with that. So you voted overwhelmingly for Brexit. Overnight, I lost my right to live in Europe, to stay wherever I wanted. That's what farmers voted for. The country's £100 billion a year worse off. That's what farmers voted for. And now the government's trying to make up the shortfall. Farmers should suck it up.
In this election campaign, Labour ruled out changing IHT. That's what people voted for. They ruled out changing agricultural property relief. Where they were elected, it wasn't in their manifesto, but Steve Reed stood up on a platform and said, we will not be changing agricultural property relief. So if you use your argument, people elected this government on the basis they would not change agricultural property relief. That's
not my argument. My argument is the farmers voted for something that's made this country £100 billion a year worse off. The government's looking at ways of making up that difference. And some farmers, a very small proportion of farmers, are going to have to pay a bit.
No, I mean, I think you're looking at this through completely the wrong lens. We have the third cheapest food in the world. We have the cheapest food in Western Europe. And unfortunately, farms are not generating a great enough profit from producing the country's food, which I'm sure everyone listening to your programme wants to be able to access homegrown, high-quality British food 3 times a day. Unfortunately, the margins we're making from that are just so low. The reinvestment in our farms is going to suffer because of this change to inheritance tax.
I agree with all the difficulties that farmers are facing, but I'll say again, voting for Brexit has injured British farming. It's injured Britain, and it seems only fair that those that favoured it should pay for it.
No, I think you're pinning this on completely the wrong group of people.
I wouldn't expect the President of the National Farmers Union to say anything else, Tom.
52% of society voted for Brexit. Farming is only a very small proportion of that.
I think the overall of farmers was 58%, so significantly higher than the actual national average. Your thoughts?
I think the politicians are playing a blinder here. They're trying to get the population arguing amongst itself while they wander off and do awful things with the country. If you want to look at it as a financial equation, the average farm income after all the outgoings, you're down into the 20,000s. A farm is not money in the bank. A farm is not something that you can go out and spend a bit of it and have in a nice cruise or a holiday or whatever. It's a factory floor, and it produces the food that the nation needs to eat. And
or you can sell it for planning permission for 100-fold and not pay any tax on it.
What's that got? No. I'm sorry, Matthew. I've never heard such rubbish in all my life.
Well, it's from a farmer, Guy Singh Watson in The Guardian, a fellow farmer. So that's his view.
And he reckons he can sell land for development without paying capital gains tax.
He says that if you reinvest, it's factual, I checked, you can reinvest the money from land sold for property back into land and you don't have to pay tax on it. That's true.
And you can do that with any business asset. It's absolutely not confined to farming.
Yeah, but not many people have loads of acres, do they?
It's called rollover relief, and I intend to do
So it's not all about
exactly
food then, is it, as we've just established? You said it's all about food, and we've just put paid to that. It's not all about food.
I am talking about the food production industry. Right. I am one of the lucky ones. The Secretary of State for Trade and Industry is taking my farm off me.
How
it's
so?
been hanging over this farm for 60 years.
60 years? Gosh.
Yes. I was at school when this farce started.
Which farce?
And I think it's going to come to an end.
Which farce? I don't know what you're talking about, sir.
Up in Tameside, well, around any city, you will have land that has been tacitly greenbelt, but which every town planner since Adam knows is going to go for redevelopment. My dad walked away from this farm in 1966 because the ministry stopped putting in subsidies because it's going to go for development. 60 years later, it looks like we've got a live one. And the only reason we've got a live one is because one Jonathan Reynolds, now Secretary of State for Trade and Industry, decided to make his legacy the creation of a 2,000-home residential estate. So this land, which was Greenbelt, was removed from the Greenbelt in February this year. There is a Red Edge residential, and it's going.
Okay, I mean, I've got absolutely no idea what that's got to do with the discussion,